Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here in another session of JSET. So JSET started in 2023, co-directed by Joel and Andrea, with the support of a Warner College of Natural Resources Dean grant for transdisciplinary approaches to environmental weed problems. Through these seminars, we are exploring different experiences and approaches that address those environmental challenges across CSU, different faculty members, students, universities in Latin America. And now we are really pleased to welcome Alicia Tyson. Thank you for being here. So Alicia is a PhD candidate on the Watershed Science program in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Sustainability. Also, she's a GIS specialist in the Center for Environmental Management of Military Lands. So Alicia grew up instilled with a deep-knit connection for her indigenous heritage, traced back to Chiapas, Mexico, land of farmers, fighters, and survivors, where socioeconomic and political complexities played out in the shadows of the Sierra Madres. Her upbringing fueled a passion for social and environmental justice as a scientist, working to address challenges at the intersection of climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and resiliency of communities and landscapes. Her background has included serving as a volunteer naturalist, a teacher, and also a mentor, leading workshops for youth in Puerto Rico, exploring the value of stewardship and integrating the sacred, the arts, and the sciences. Drawing also upon academic training in behavioral communications, journalism, anthropology, GIS, geosciences, and watershed science, her current research at CSU, past research, and other consulting efforts reflects this passion. Her current work in Western Puerto Rico and past work in the Peruvian Andes promotes the value of mixed methods and transdisciplinary geospatial analysis to assess socio-ecological risk, susceptibility, and vulnerability to landslides. The approaches empower the knowledge, attitudes, and belief systems of communities often underrepresented and marginalized in collaborative resource management. Central to her work throughout the United States is the prioritization of supporting and enhancing local capacity, particularly when historically marginalized communities, through co-creative integration of indigenous knowledge and local ecological knowledge. It is through the lenses of these experiences that Alicia examines the value as well as challenges to conduct team science in a post-disaster hazard-prone landscapes. So Alicia, thank you so much for being here. Now I'll give you the floor to proceed with your presentation, I have your presentation, so I'm going to project it here. Please let me know if you can see my screen.
Thank you so much, Paula. I appreciate it very much. Thank you for the introduction. Very kind.
Sure. So I'm going to present your slides, and so please let me know when I have to change them or to proceed with them.
I'm sorry, I cannot see from my view. Do you already have them presented?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. What are you seeing now?
She has her notes on her screen, so she can't see.
So I have to.
Yeah, she'll just tell you.
Okay. Oh, yeah, Alicia, sorry for that.
Okay. No problem. I just I don't see the shared screen, that's all. No problem, thank you. So today, I'll be taking a look at how we implement truly just, if not successful, however we determine that term, team science, particularly in post-disaster hazard-prone landscapes. These are particular landscapes that carry with them a whole range of unique variables and unique settings that challenge how we do team science. And through that process of analysis, I'll also explore some of the basic underlying conceptual frameworks for how we define team science, the way we think about this emerging field, the science of team science, and what that tells us about the best practices for doing team science, let alone doing it in a post-disaster landscape. Additionally, I'll also explore these concepts and these best practices as applicable through a case study that depicts the experience that I had and a number of the researchers had in Puerto Rico a few years ago. Next slide, please. So to provide context for this analysis that I'm presenting today, and for the purpose of the analysis, at a very high level, I'm defining the terms team science, as you see represented here, as a collaborative effort across disciplines that challenges the strengths and expertise of professionals trained in different fields, different disciplines, but toward a common goal or research aim. It's a very high level definition, a very almost generalized definition. And I think what I learned as well through this analysis is that we actually need to unpack that further. Next slide, please. To unpack that, I explored what does this term really mean, and particularly within the scope of this field, the science of team science. So the science of team science explores the hows and whys of doing this thing we call team science. And I'll unpack that term even more in a second. And explores what it is we really mean by that. Adding to this complexity is a question of how we do this in a post-disaster or hazard-prone setting, which, as I mentioned before, carries these unique challenges and considerations. Next slide. Or I think there's an animation maybe on that slide.
It's a question, your question.
Yes. So then you can go on to the next slide, please. So the table you see here is a representation of the deep dive I did into what are the ranges of these terms that are often symbiotic, used symbiotically or interchangeably with this concept of team science. But those terms, from my own personal experience and from what I found in the literature, are really not so interchangeable. And we really do mean, across multiple disciplines, different things by these different terms. So in summary, to state that another important component of understanding this concept of team science, as well as its practical application, is understanding these terms that are often used interchangeably. And as you can see here, these include interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary. These terms, as I mentioned, are not truly interchangeable. And alignment with each one of these terms in a given project setting carries with it its own unique conceptual underpinnings when carrying out that project that can have a great significance for how teams and disciplines engage, not just internally, but externally with the landscape, with the communities that they're working with. And as you can see across all three of those columns, there's a great diversity of thought about what constitutes each of these terms and the conceptual underpinnings for each of them. But as you can see from the highlighted words, there's also some commonalities. So within those commonalities in particular, I wanted to call your attention to what is shown in the interdisciplinary column and transdisciplinary column. So when we move from multi to inter and transdisciplinary, we move from a space where there are distinct, unique groups of people representing different disciplines to beginning to understand what we mean by integrate. But there's a distinct jump between interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary, between what is meant by integration. And for me, when I look at the range of concepts and the range of definitions that I found, it's a jump from simply coalescing and integrating all of these different ideas, different knowledge, maybe sometimes new knowledge, to actually applying that knowledge in a new, novel way with new concepts, new frameworks, new methods that move beyond any one single discipline. So there's a unique collaboration perhaps in the interdisciplinary space, but really it's transcends. Now, what does that mean? It transcends. It's something completely new outside of any one discipline. And I think that's the piece that I've seen in the literature is often the piece where teams struggle the most, because we are so bound by what we have learned in our respective disciplines, the language of those disciplines, the methodological constraints of those disciplines. And this is where a lot of the change, a lot of the shift is happening as well in the science of team science. Next slide, please. So to explore this even further, I conducted a literature review across multiple disciplines that you see listed here, exploring these different definitions and other ways of describing team science, and really data mining these resources for best practices, as well as for lessons learned. They weren't always termed as best practices. A lot of these studies were we attempted to do this thing called team science, or we were multidisciplinary, we were transdisciplinary, even though they weren't according to the previous table. But what did we learn we could have done differently? What were the challenges? What were the pitfalls? Were we really successful, whatever that means? So essentially, I was looking for an identification of not just the characteristics of effective team science, but in a minute, I'll show you some of the challenges that teams face when trying to implement team science. So as I began to coalesce these findings, a picture began to emerge from across disciplines. And it was interesting to know which disciplines highlighted certain characteristics or benefits or even challenges over others. So there was agreement certainly across certain disciplines that in practice, whether in the academic space or practitioner space, there usually is some conceptual overlap, or you often see those people working together versus disciplines that are often very solitary in the way they conduct their research. So it was a very interesting finding to see how that ranges across different disciplines. Next slide, please. So here you see some of the primary characteristics of what the literature identifies as those characteristics that are necessary for truly effective team science. Team science that has an impact, that address some of the objectives or solution or problems that were set out in a given research project or practitioner environment, or were able to derive some kind of metric to determine at the end of a project, however long it was, and time is certainly a significant factor, there was some sort of implementation period that addressed the core problem that was the subject of the research. I've highlighted the term interactive here because there's a lot to unpack what is meant here. The setting in which the interaction takes place, the how and where, the frequency, who is interacting, all of these aspects can drastically change the manner of the collaboration. And here's where we start to merge into, well, how is this unique in a post-disaster setting? Particularly in an immediately post-disaster setting. It's really vital to consider how you as a researcher step into privileged spaces, particularly if you are not from that region or are not a member of the community that you're engaging with. So understanding the sensitivity of those interactions, the necessary trust building, as well as I would argue the humility and the respect needed is essential. I'm also calling attention in this slide to what happened following Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, in that there were a number of what is termed parachute projects that occurred immediately following, in the immediate months after the hurricane, after both hurricanes, Irma and Maria, meaning there were external institutions that sent teams of researchers, not from Puerto Rico, down to the island to collect narratives and engage with island institutions and communities, and then left, often with little promise of reflecting learnings or outlining benefits to the traumatized communities. And I say traumatized communities with no limit on what that can mean. Truly traumatized communities on every level. Data collection protocols also need to reflect, I argue, that the awareness of the social as well as the physical environment in which you're operating is really a key. Just because you are, for example, an atmospheric scientist developing models to mimic the forces and variables and physics of what was happening before and after the storms, doesn't mean you're not having an impact. You're even, and in this case, we're starting to merge into the case study, which I'll get to in a couple slides, scientists who would journey down to the island for meetings thinking, we're not really interacting with communities. That's not our mandate. That's not our research objective. But in reality, just having a presence there, going into a restaurant, identifying yourself as a researcher, let alone not understanding the context within which you are doing the research has an impact far beyond even just that singular visit. And so that's this level and this need to have an awareness of the space that you're stepping into and the greater socio-ecological context that you're stepping into is important, I would argue, for every single member of a team, regardless if you think you are going to be directly engaging with a community. Another example is someone might be going down there to collect soil samples on a given agricultural landscape. And they're thinking, well, I'm just collecting samples, I'm dealing with the soil science, or I'm dealing with what has been the impact of sedimentation from all the landslides. I'm not really engaging with the community. Well, even interacting with that farmer, even collecting that data sends a certain message to the community. That has impact, and that needs to be considered in the design of the project. Next slide, please. So across multiple disciplines, what you see listed here on the left and the right to a degree, were identified as challenges to effective team science, or the ability to maximize some inherent value in team science. So as I mentioned in the review of best practices for successful teams, effective communication and the capacity to translate across disciplines are both hallmarks of team cohesion, but also conversely can be a great challenge. If team members, let alone principal investigators on a project, are not trained, are not in a place of understanding of why that has value, why they need to aid those team members in helping to understand how to translate from the value of one discipline over in the other, that's not going to trickle down into the team. That's not going to then express itself in the work being done. So teams must also learn to identify a shared framework for research approaches and methods that aid in the translation of the terminology specific to a single discipline. This means accounting for things like cultural and linguistic framings, working across different academic practitioner teams that might represent different institutions, and the limits of those institutions and the support they give or the direction they give to different team members, let alone different types of data. What might be valuable data to a social science team might mean something different to a team of physical scientists looking at hydrologic impact, for example. Additionally, I want to point out that team composition came up quite frequently as a challenge, as the researchers often confront fears of being on a diverse team, especially because there's this underlying assumption that diverse teams from different disciplines and other ways that we think of diversity are conflict prone. That's the assumption going in. And so there's this inherent challenge of navigating cross-cultural identities, cross-cultural awarenesses with external partners. That can then be expressed, if you follow that thread out, to how teams engage with the external community, how they might engage with partners, collaborators beyond the research team itself. Next slide, please. So to then carry this analysis through a case study and explore the application of team science best practices in a post-disaster setting, I use an evaluation of a project that took me to Puerto Rico in 2018. This NSF-funded project sought to evaluate the impact of Hurricane Maria on critical infrastructure through the lens, which you'll see here in a second, of a variety of different disciplines. I think it's important to note that in addition to my role as a researcher at the University of Puerto Rico in Mayagüez, managing geospatial data, processing, validation, and management to support multiple models, such as flood models and sedimentation models, I also was conducting research central to my dissertation. So I was in a unique position as the only external researcher sent down to the island to live and work for the life of this project, as well as to lead my own field-based activities. So I had the benefit of a dual lens of how it is to conduct research that you're solely responsible for, as well as to be a member of a transdisciplinary team. I don't know that I would call us, or an interdisciplinary team. I don't know that I would call us transdisciplinary. And the primary academic partners, as you see here, being two universities from New York, Arizona State, and the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez. There was also a consulting group out of Chicago. The only representation on the project from Puerto Rico was the professor I worked for and myself. So here you had a massive, massive team or set of teams doing research down the island with the majority of the representation from the beginning not being of the island on which the research was done. Next slide, please. For the sake of time, I won't go into too much detail as to the goals and objectives of this research project, just to say that if you were to look on paper, if you were to look at the goals of and objectives for this particular project, you would think automatically, oh, this is at least an interdisciplinary project, if not transdisciplinary. We're trying to pull all of these different teams together to address these very critical problems, and we're going to need all of them to be able to do this work. Next slide, please. Here are a few examples of some of the different analyses that took place, some of the different research questions, analysis and exams that went on. Just a few, there were many more. And I'm sharing this to say that we were looking at a variety of different aspects of critical infrastructure that were heavily impacted, if not all just completely destroyed by the hurricane. Energy, communications, water, transportation, agricultural and food systems, and communication networks, and other types of networks such as social networks. So being such an inherently team-based systems set of problems and challenges, this was an extremely optimal situation where the value of team science could really potentially have an impact, if not on a transdisciplinary level. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I worked to apply a sedimentation model. This is the soil and water assessment tool model within one watershed on the western side of the island, the Rio Grande de Añasco watershed. I also worked to conduct a vulnerability assessment by integrating a landslide impact assessment with social vulnerability. And you can see some of the results here. I don't have time to go into all of the levels of detail of these results that were quite interesting and exciting to see. But the bottom line being, I was trying to look at the ways that we can understand social vulnerability, and specific to the relationship of the landslides to specific streams, slope, and road segments across the watershed and within each of the different barrios or the neighborhoods on the island. I'd hoped would tell us something about not just the socio-ecological vulnerability of the watershed, but also what are the areas of prioritization from a practitioner standpoint when it comes to hazard mitigation moving forward, when it comes to helping the municipalities prioritize researchers, but then also helping to underscore some of the work being done on the NSF project to highlight areas that we need to focus when engaging with communities. There are a lot of different outcomes and results from doing these various analyses. I do want to also acknowledge, as a part of this work that I was doing, that there is an inherent limitation to applying the Social Vulnerability Index in Puerto Rico. And I note this in my dissertation, and I noted in my work, and anytime I talk about this, that there were a number of gaps in the census data used to generate the Social Vulnerability Index for the time period that I was reporting on. And so there's some margin of error. However, having the benefit of living there for over a year, engaging with these communities, spending a significant amount of time within the landscape, I was able to ground truth a lot of the information that was derived. So I had the benefit of that. Unfortunately, a number of the other teams on the NSF project did not have that benefit, and it created some challenges going forward. Next slide, please. So drawing this back around to then how this team science was conducted, my own role in it, and the application of different best practices, I want to take a minute to point out some key concepts that did not show up in any of the literature that I reviewed, and that was these issues of justice and equity. These were noticeably absent from the literature reviewed across all the disciplines, including the science of team science itself. And I would argue that the role of justice and equity in conducting research in post-disaster settings is incredibly important, if not more important than almost any other setting, because you are commonly inherently rooted in team engagements, both internally again and externally. So by focusing on these issues of justice and equity when applying team science in a post-disaster setting, I offer that these following learnings, assessments, and critical considerations must be a part of the conversation from the beginning of a study design. In particular, I can't underscore enough the need to spend time understanding the way trauma is affecting not just the community way of life, but also systems and landscapes. Even if you are primarily modeling some kind of system that does not typically involve within the scope of research interacting directly with community members. At some point, you are potentially interacting with stakeholders. You're maybe presenting your results. So having a deepened understanding also informs your approach, your validation process, and your context. I could also speak to the personal and professional challenges of being a researcher in a post-disaster setting, both as an external researcher, meaning I'm not from Puerto Rico, living in the area of focus, and as a local researcher, having lived the trauma of living in the post-disaster setting. And I was also there during the time of an entire year of earthquakes as well. And so I'm engaging almost daily, whether formally or informally, with participants in the communities. So enough cannot be said for the consideration of leadership of a team to consider the role that these variables have, these concepts have, this core level framework has on how we do this work and how we engage with these communities and understand and appreciate the value of their personal, mental, emotional, psychological impact of living in this post-disaster setting. This might mean that not just social scientists have to learn what it means to be trained to understand impact of a disaster, that we need to work harder at empowering and engaging with local researchers and community leaders, not just coming into a landscape and saying, all right, we're here to fix your problems, and bringing tangible benefits back to engaged communities. Next slide, please. Within the scope of the case study and kind of in response to some of these literature gaps, as well as response to what myself and another researcher identified as shortcomings within the project to really integrate the teams, to really achieve any kind of team science, we worked to develop a workshop that was an approach aimed at understanding the integration challenges you see listed here. That I go into further detail in my dissertation, that particular to a post-disaster setting present unique obstacles in much deeper ways to being able to connect with communities, but also to really truly contextualize conceptual approaches, methodologies, and data inputs and outputs. I don't have time to go into every single one of these challenges, but in the research that I do, I take a look at each one of these and unpack them and take a look at assessing the degree to which each of those play out in a post-disaster setting, uniquely using this case study as a framework. Next slide, please. So this is an image from the workshop in which all of the members of all the teams across all the universities, all the institutions came together. And we asked them to identify then what their particular team, whether they're the energy team or the social science team or the geophysical team, what were their research objectives or research questions? What were their conceptual approaches, their methodologies, and then what were their data inputs and outputs? So if you've ever watched a murder mystery or detective show, this image may or may not look familiar. It kind of looks a little bit like a murder board, drawing correlations between different ideas and variables. And the physical act, I can just share the physical act of having participants come to the board and be able to look at side by side what the contrasts and similarities might be between teams, and then to actually draw those connections illuminated opportunities for streamlining the work that we were all doing. There were multiple instances of people not being aware that they were duplicating not just data preparation work, but analysis itself. It illuminated opportunities for new collaborations, Like I said, recognizing duplications of efforts and really unrealized synchronicity of efforts in very real and tangible ways. And this took place approximately almost a year into a 3-year project. Doing something like this kind of workshop or this kind of activity early on and building it into the study design could have a real impact into how we understand, particularly in a post-disaster setting, this team science approach that is particularly helpful in a post-disaster setting, because oftentimes in those settings, you're not just dealing with a system of problems, you're engaging with stakeholders, practitioners from across various different themselves disciplines and sectors. And so having that systems mindset and being able to see internally those connections will help you be even more powerful as a researcher, as a team as a whole. Next slide, please. So to sum up, I think some of the biggest takeaways from this analysis and this exploration of the case study is that there really are truly significant gaps in the literature across disciplines about how we conduct team science, full stop, just team science, let alone how we do that work in stress systems. And more of the systems in which we're operating in are stressed in varying degrees of stress. That understanding the role of justice and equity within particularly a post-disaster setting is really going to be important as a piece of the study design. Even if you are primarily looking at a geophysical suite of problems, or your team is half made up of engineers, understanding this context and your impact is really critical. I also challenge that maybe understanding best practices from across literature is not necessarily enough. In action, there really has to be an expression of the leadership and the experienced team members exemplifying what it means to operate as a team. And that's no small thing that has to be built into the expectations, the goals, and the expression of the research itself. And one mechanism of doing this is to integrate the arts and the sciences, as we did with the workshop. I also throw out the question of whether or not in the future, do we really know yet what it means to do true transdisciplinary integration, to really develop truly novel ways? And have we really built the setting for that to happen yet? And I think until we can address these issues of justice and equity, until we can address this need to really understand what we mean by team science, we're not going to be able to elevate to that level yet. I also put out there that I think it is really important that we take a look at what disaster science might have to teach all of us, because it is often conducted in these acute settings in which the scientists and the community interacts on very unique ways. And that as a discipline, as a field, can often be inherently at least multidisciplinary, if not interdisciplinary. And that might be a good proving ground to understand how we move forward as scientists working in a team. And with that, to leave time for questions, next slide, I will wrap up. I know that was a lot of information in a short period of time and high level to a degree, but I will wrap up there and I welcome any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alicia. Yeah, now we can proceed to questions. I don't know if maybe here someone have any comments or questions.
Yeah, because especially it's like.
No, por favor, David.
Okay, thanks Alicia for the presentation. I was curious about what you mentioned about the social vulnerability index. Like, what was the idea you have? And you said that there were different elements that made you unable to your team to kind of do what you were thinking or planning before. But what was it, and like why was not possible to do it? That's my question.
I think I understand at least the first part. I might need to ask you a question about the second part of the question. So the inclusion of the social vulnerability index was to be able to provide a starting point across the watershed to understand where, at least from a data perspective, at a high level, the social vulnerability spread exists across the watershed, whether we're looking at the demographics of literacy or we're looking at demographics of income. There's a lot built into the social vulnerability index that tries to take all of these different factors into account and say, here's where the most vulnerable municipalities might exist. So it was really operated as a starting point, short of being able to go into the municipalities, if not into the barrios themselves, and conduct neighborhood scale interviews or engagements with individuals to understand what their reality is, to really ground truth. Here's what the aggregated data says. Okay, what's reality? And how closely do those match? I was not, for a variety of reasons, able to do as dense a study as I'd hoped originally, to be able to go through each of the neighborhoods and to ground a lot of the data. But from a lot of the engagements I had with farmers, with some of the community leaders throughout the watershed, I was able to like I said, ground truth a bit of it. But I recognize that the very basis of using census data, and particularly for the year I used it, there was a high margin of error. Even the CDC came out and it issued a white paper saying, we recognize there's problems with this data. But again, I wanted to use it as a starting point. I think maybe the other question you had is perhaps referring to some of the challenges that our teams had with engaging with the communities. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, like you kind of mentioned that you were not able, right now you mentioned that you were not able to go to each of the neighborhoods. But that was kind of like also my question, like what will be needed so that you will be able to make
do that?
Uh-huh.
So there's two ways of answering that come to mind. One is a learning from a challenge that the team had as a whole, was to understand opportunities to integrate approaches across the disciplines. So while I was essentially on the geophysical team, but then also pulling in the social science data, because I also have a background in anthropology, and so I understood the value of integrating that. The social science team was conducting their research in a different landscape, a different watershed, going through different processes, and there was not integration between the two teams. So there was not a syncing up of efforts across the teams in the way that methodologies and in the way that the activities were taking place. So there was a disconnect that existed there in the kind of post-autopsy view of how the research was being conducted. I think there was also a significant gap in understanding the value of engaging with local communities and local researchers, even local students. Thankfully, and I think it's only because of the blessing I had of living down there, I understood just how many students, as well as other professors at the university down there, were already engaged in some of this work. So I lobbied with the PIs on the project to be able to hire local students to be able to assist in this process of going out to neighborhoods, whether they were on the social science team or they were working with me in some of the field work I was doing. But that was not an original part of the study design at all. Had already been work done by some of the professors at the university there to go out to the communities and understand and assess the impact, the challenges that they faced. None of that data was being incorporated into our research. So there was a big disconnect that I observed. And thankfully, by being able to bring in those teams, and then by virtue of the fact that I have that background, I was able to provide training for those teams of student researchers who went out and be able to then integrate that awareness of a trauma risk-informed perspective when you're going out to these communities, and be able to take that into consideration. But on the whole, throughout the project, that was not something that was implemented across the board. Did that mostly get at what you're asking?
Yeah, thanks. Awesome. Good. Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, questions.
Yes, please.
The first one, if to improve the results of the project, to be more transdisciplinary, to involve the communities, to generate that information, what would be the ideal setting that we imagine for that particular region or case study? How to fund that and how to integrate that? And the second point is, how do you think that, well, first, thank you for your insights and your thinking about that. So nice. The second, how do you think the relation between extension service and with science in order to move more landscape-based results? How could it be that, or if you have thinking or experience on doing that?
These are excellent questions. I wish I could have like a whole hour to talk about that with you, because these are two of the most core questions that I come back to a lot. How to improve the results and the approaches. I'll tackle that one first. I think it requires, at the very minimum, having PIs as part of the design of the project, acknowledge the value and building into the timeline, if not into the way the project is designed and then consequently funded, that there is a necessary period of team formation, team understanding, team contextualization within the project itself before you even go to the landscape. That there has to be that time period of really understanding the inherent value of all of the different disciplines represented on the team. And if you don't have that effective communication and that effective leadership to reinforce those disciplinary values across disciplines, then the default that I witnessed was that every discipline, not against the person that they were engaging with on the other team, but every discipline, because they have their own language, their own biases, views another discipline as either irrelevant or it's not as irrelevant, let alone potentially wrong. And they don't see the inherent value. Then how as a team as a whole can you really be successful if you're not maximizing that potential, let alone moving into a transdisciplinary space and trying to develop something completely new where all disciplines are contributing. I think funding is a whole other piece of this that is inherently problematic because so many of the research questions that were identified were so identified because of the funding institution that student was listed under. So their goals and objectives individually, whether they were obtaining a PhD or doing a certain research project, were defined by their parent institution, not by the team, not by the project. So the resources they had at their disposal, their funding, and I'm not talking about the NSF piece of it, but their particular position within their university also defined how they acted within the team. And that's a whole other piece of the challenge that I go into in more detail, because whether or not you have an institution that as a whole, let alone a department that understands the value of interdisciplinary research and transdisciplinary research and has empowered that student with the skills and the understanding of how to enact that, you're fighting an uphill battle if you combine that with not having PIs that understand that value either. I think external major institutions like NSF and other such big funding sources like that are really challenged right now, because if you look at their calls for research, they seem to, on the surface, on paper, promote the value of team science and transdisciplinary work and interdisciplinary work. But oftentimes what I've observed is that the timelines that are stipulated for carrying out that work don't necessarily fund the type of work that's needed to build a team that will actually do that work and to enact the time that it needs to be able to really set the foundation for the implementation of that work. And so it's almost like there needs to be a sea wave change in the way funding structures support this kind of work. That's really, whether it's comes from the avenue of funding science of team science level work, even if that's within, say, a given other discipline, there's got to be some other kind of shift, I think, in understanding what we're really funding. That it's not just about a given map analysis or a deliverable, that it's the process that matters as well. Speaking of that, to your other excellent question about extension services. So I engaged a lot with the Agricultural Extension Service there at the University of Puerto Rico. Amazing researchers doing incredible work out in the community. I engaged with them as a part of my dissertation work. They were not a significant stakeholder in the NSF project. So I had one foot in each of these two worlds of seeing what was happening in the NSF project and the teams, and then doing my research as well at the same time. And I thought it was an extreme miss on the part of the NSF project. I'm not trying to throw anyone under the bus or say the whole project was wrong or did poor work, but to not engage with an entire body of researchers that is already doing work out in the communities, that is already inherently at least interdisciplinary in the way they view the system interactions, I think is a flaw in study design if you're not understanding the value of engaging with extension services. And I think maybe taking that even deeper within an academic setting and the way we train researchers, that value needs to be reinforced through the training as students go through their training to generate their MA or MS or PhD. Understanding the value, that it's not just something that's tacked on, or people who can't do research go into extension services or some other kind of assumption like that, that there's really great inherent value in extension services, and understanding the soft skills, as they call them, the social skills of engaging with communities, that is actually really core and fundamental. It's not just something only a certain segment of researchers do, or something you hope gets done, especially in a trauma-prone landscape. I hope that answered your questions.
Sure. Yeah, one question, quick question. I saw
Sure.
you are in a GIS, and does that understanding helps to see especially and to integrate disciplines and try to express that in maps or data or thinking about that?
The short answer is yes, I think so, because I think you inherently see patterns in data. You see things from a landscape perspective, and that means that you're taking into account all the components of the landscape, socially and ecologically. And so for me, it's a natural fit to see the systems as they play out across the landscape. And I guess the term is geek out when it comes to looking at data and the story it tells about the landscape, and then actually getting to go into the landscape and understand firsthand what the representations of that data really mean for people in their daily lives. So yes, absolutely. I think that's a core piece of it. Thank you so much for your questions. Yes, please.
Alicia. Thank you so much. That was super interesting. Could you speak a little more to the post-disaster or hazard-prone setting? Because I think a lot of the things you've laid out here apply for any kind of project that is place-based or that aims to be place-based. So what is it about post-disaster that is different? You've mentioned trauma for sure, but could you talk about that a little more?
Absolutely, great question. Thank you for asking that. I think some of what I observed firsthand and then what I saw represented in the literature with respect to a post-disaster setting, there's two kind of almost two buckets of responses I could choose from with that question. One is the practicalities of how we conduct research in those settings. So in a post-disaster setting, you're still dealing with the realities, potentially, of a constantly shifting landscape. And I don't mean that otherwise ecosystems are static, but roads still failing, mountain slopes still failing, frequent flooding because the physical built infrastructure has been destroyed. The realities of being able to try and conduct research in those settings from a purely practical standpoint become incredibly difficult. And if that's not built into study design and our understanding of how we're trying to do this important work in those settings, then there's a lot of loss of time, there's a lot of loss of resources, and that's not taken into account. So having an appreciation for the way the ecosystems have been impacted and the degree to which they might still be in recovery themselves can challenge the way we do that kind of work from a purely practical standpoint. Throughout the year that I was there were still constant active hill slopes failures. There was flooding with just regular rain, not even major storms. There were roads that were inaccessible. There were slopes that were inaccessible. So it will change the way you conduct the research from a methodological standpoint. On another side of it, I think the other challenges that are unique to a hazard-prone or post-disaster setting lies within our understanding of what that means for the communities. And yes, you acknowledge the trauma piece, but it's also understanding, taking, how do I say this? It's about taking that step back and saying, are we actually asking the questions that matter most to the communities and to the setting that is currently in a recovery state? Are we asking the questions because we think as researchers that these are the solutions, these are the problems that need to be most addressed, or are we contextualizing them appropriately? And having an appreciation for the fact that when we are engaging with those communities, being in a state of post-traumatic stress, being in a state of trauma, their awareness and their ability to participate in any kind of research project is going to be affected by that lived experience. So if we're trying to do work that involves engaging, including just simply asking a farmer, can I go onto your land and do some soil samples, assess how the stretch of the river channel changed your access to irrigation, that interaction alone is having an impact and potentially also adding burden to that community that is already dealing with a level of burden that is beyond a normal setting. And so being aware of that burdening piece, I think applies actually socioecologically to the setting in a post-disaster setting. Those are some of the most immediate that come to mind.
Thank you.
Well, that's wonderful. I have comments and questions as well, but we're also at 1 o'clock, so I want to respect your time and everybody else's time. But very excited for your work and looking forward to having future conversations, because I think there's lots of points of connection and that come very much from the study that you've been doing, the work that you've been doing, that really resonate with the conversations we've been having in this forum for the last kind of year plus. And so it's really nice to learn from your work and to have you contribute those perspectives to the conversation, and just really want to applaud you for really strong and excellent research, and also for helping us think through, I think, a lot of things that are present of mind as well within this group. So thank you so much for your contributions today.
Thank you all very much, and please feel free to reach out by the email that I posted there. I'm happy to continue to talk about all of this.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for the opportunity. Thank you. Thank you.
We know you're super busy working on the dissertation.
Yeah. Mucha suerte.
Gracias. Gracias a todos.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao.
Ciao.